Margaret Chen walked slowly through the crowded shopping mall, her weathered hands clutching a small purse that had seen better days. At 73 years old, she moved with the careful steps of someone who had learned to navigate the world quietly, without drawing attention to herself. Her coat, once a deep navy blue, had faded to a pale gray blue after decades of wear. The fabric showed signs of careful mending in several places, and the sleeves had been shortened and re-hemmed multiple times. The afternoon sun streamed through the mall's skylights, casting harsh light on everything and everyone. Margaret needed to buy groceries, but she had made the mistake of coming during the busy weekend rush. Young people hurried past her, their arms full of shopping bags from expensive stores. Their clothes were bright and new, their shoes squeaked against the polished floors, and their laughter echoed off the high ceilings. As Margaret approached the escalator, she noticed a group of teenage girls standing near the food court. They were dressed in the latest fashion trends, each carrying designer handbags that probably cost more than Margaret spent on groceries in 3 months. Their hair was perfectly styled, their makeup flawless, and they radiated the confidence that comes with youth and privilege. "Look at that old woman," one of the girls whispered, not quite quietly enough. She pointed in Margaret's direction, making sure her friends could see who she was talking about. "That coat looks like it came from a thrift store 50 years ago." The other girls giggled, covering their mouths with their manicured hands. "I can't believe people go out in public wearing things like that," another girl added, her voice dripping with disdain. "It's so embarrassing. Doesn't she have any pride?" Margaret heard every word. She had developed sharp hearing over the years, a skill that had served her well in many situations. Her face remained calm, but her grip on her purse tightened slightly. She had faced much worse than teenage mockery in her life, but it still stung to be treated as if she were invisible, or worse, something to be ashamed of. "Maybe she doesn't have money for new clothes," suggested a third girl. But her tone suggested she found this possibility more amusing than sad. "Some people just don't know how to take care of themselves." The first girl laughed louder. "Well, if I ever get that old and pathetic, just put me out of my misery. I mean, seriously, how hard is it to buy a decent coat? Even Walmart has better options than whatever that is." Margaret continued walking, her head held high despite the cruel words following her. She had learned long ago that responding to such comments only made things worse. These young people had no idea what her coat represented, no understanding of the journeys it had taken her on, or the memories woven into its faded fabric. As she passed a store window, Margaret caught her reflection and paused for a moment. The coat did look worn, she had to admit. The hem was uneven where she had shortened it herself, and there was a small stain near the left pocket that she had never been able to remove completely. But looking at it also brought back a flood of memories that made her chest tight with emotion. She remembered the day she had first put on this coat, more than 40 years ago. It had been a gift, carefully chosen and presented with pride and love. The fabric had been thick and luxurious then, the color rich and deep. The brass buttons had gleamed, and the cut had been fashionable and flattering. The teenagers were still talking behind her, their voices carrying across the open space of the mall. Other shoppers were starting to notice the commotion, some stopping to listen, others quickly looking away when they realized what was happening. Margaret could feel their eyes on her, some sympathetic, others merely curious about the drama unfolding. "I bet she doesn't even realize how ridiculous she looks," one of the girls continued, her voice getting louder with each cruel observation. "Someone should really tell her. It would be a kindness, honestly." A few adult shoppers frowned in the teenagers' direction, clearly disapproving of their behavior, but no one spoke up. This was the way of the world, Margaret knew. People preferred to avoid confrontation, to let unpleasantness pass by without getting involved. She didn't blame them. She had done the same thing herself many times over the years. Margaret reached the escalator and stepped onto the moving stairs, her hand gripping the rubber rail for balance. As she rose to the upper level, she could still hear fragments of the girls' conversation drifting up from below. They had moved on to critiquing other shoppers now, their attention spans as short as their empathy. The upper level of the mall was quieter, filled with older stores that catered to practical needs rather than fashion trends. Margaret made her way toward the grocery store, passing a small cafe where elderly couples sat over coffee and newspapers. These people looked at her with recognition and respect, the kind of acknowledgement that comes from shared experience and understanding. She found the grocery store and took a small cart, checking her carefully written shopping list. Every item had been chosen based on price and necessity. Margaret had become an expert at stretching a limited budget, finding ways to eat well without spending more than she could afford. It was a skill she had learned out of necessity, but also one that came from a lifetime of understanding the true value of things. As she moved through the aisles, Margaret allowed herself to think about the coat again. If those young people knew the truth about what they were mocking, would they feel differently? Would they understand that sometimes the most worn and humble things carry the greatest stories? The coat had traveled with her across oceans and continents. It had kept her warm during some of the most challenging periods of her life. It had been her constant companion through loss and grief, through moments of triumph that no one else had witnessed, and through quiet acts of courage that had never made headlines. Near the produce section, Margaret noticed an elderly man struggling to reach something on a high shelf. Without hesitation, she approached and offered to help, standing on her toes to grab the item he needed. He thanked her warmly, and they spent a few minutes chatting about the weather and the prices of groceries. This was the Margaret that the teenagers in the food court had not seen. This was the woman who still found ways to help others despite her own challenges, who treated everyone with kindness regardless of how they were dressed or where they came from. This was the person hidden beneath the faded coat that had become the target of their mockery. As she finished her shopping and made her way back through the mall, Margaret wondered if she would encounter the group of girls again. Part of her hoped she wouldn't have to endure more of their comments. But another part of her felt a quiet strength building inside. She had survived much worse than teenage cruelty, and she would survive this too. The coat might be faded and worn, but it still served its purpose. It still kept her warm, still fit her properly, and still carried all the memories and meaning that made it precious to her. Sometimes the most important things in life were not the newest or shiniest or most expensive. Sometimes they were the things that had proven their worth through time and service, through loyalty and endurance. Margaret walked toward the exit, ready to continue her day, unaware that her encounter with judgment and mockery was far from over, and that very soon someone would recognize what the teenagers had failed to see. 20 minutes later, Margaret found herself back on the main level of the mall, her grocery shopping completed. She had managed to stay within her budget, even finding a few items on sale that would help stretch her meals for the week. As she walked toward the exit, she noticed that the group of teenage girls was still gathered near the food court, though their number had grown. They were now joined by a few teenage boys, and their conversation had become louder and more animated. Margaret tried to take a different route to avoid them, but the layout of the mall made it impossible. She would have to pass near their table to reach the exit she had used when arriving. "Oh, look, she's back," announced the girl who had started the earlier mockery. "And look at those grocery bags. I bet she's buying cat food for herself because it's cheaper than real food." The boys joined in the laughter, encouraged by their audience. "Maybe we should take up a collection for her," one of them suggested with mock concern. "Help her buy a coat from this century." Margaret quickened her pace, hoping to pass by quickly without further incident. But as she approached their area, one of the boys stood up and blocked her path. He was tall and athletic, probably a member of his high school's basketball team with the confidence that comes from being popular and well-liked. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said, his tone falsely polite. "My friends and I were wondering about your coat. It looks like it has some kind of patch or emblem on it. Is that supposed to mean something, or is it just decoration?" Margaret looked down at the small emblem sewn near the coat's left breast pocket. It was barely visible now, the colors faded and the edges frayed from decades of wear. Most people never noticed it, and she rarely thought about it anymore. But this young man had sharp eyes, and his question caught her off guard. "It's nothing that would interest you," she replied quietly, trying to step around him. But he moved again, maintaining his position in her path. The girls were watching intently now, sensing that their entertainment was about to continue. "Come on, don't be shy," the boy pressed. "We're just curious. It looks military or something. Were you in the army? Did they even let women in the army back in your day?" The question was asked with such casual disrespect that several nearby shoppers stopped to stare. An older couple exchanged worried glances, and a middle-aged woman with children looked like she was considering whether to intervene. But Margaret had been handling situations like this for most of her life. "Young man," she said firmly, "I need to leave now. Please step aside." Instead of moving, the teenager called back to his friends. "Hey guys, the old lady was apparently some kind of soldier. Can you imagine her trying to march or do push-ups?" His imitation of a frail elderly person attempting military exercises drew loud laughter from the group. Margaret felt her face flush with a combination of anger and embarrassment. The emblem they were mocking represented years of her life that these children could never understand. It represented sacrifice and service, loss and honor, moments of terror and acts of bravery that had shaped her into the woman she had become. "Maybe she was just a secretary or something," suggested one of the girls. "You know, making coffee for the real soldiers." "Or maybe she bought the coat at a costume shop," added another. "Some people like to pretend they're more important than they actually are." The crowd of onlookers was growing larger, but still no one stepped forward to defend Margaret. She could see sympathy in some faces, disapproval in others, but the teenagers seemed oblivious to the fact that their behavior was making other people uncomfortable. Margaret straightened her shoulders and looked directly at the boy blocking her path. "That emblem," she said slowly, "represents 32 years of service to this country. I earned it through deployments in places you've probably never heard of, doing things you couldn't imagine. I've seen friends die and held dying strangers in my arms. I've made decisions that saved lives and carried burdens that would break most people." Her voice was calm, but carried an authority that made the teenager take a small step backward. For a moment, the group fell silent, unsure how to respond to this unexpected revelation. "Yeah, right," the first girl finally said, breaking the silence with forced laughter. "If you were really some kind of war hero, you'd have a better coat. And you'd probably live in a fancy house, not shopping for bargains like a poor person." "Heroes get medals and parades," agreed one of the boys. "They don't end up looking like homeless people in shopping malls." Margaret realized that nothing she could say would change their minds. They had decided who she was based on her appearance, and no amount of truth would penetrate their prejudice. She also realized that she was attracting exactly the kind of attention she had spent years trying to avoid. "Believe what you want," she said simply, and moved to go around the group. This time they let her pass, but their comments followed her. "Some people will say anything for attention," one girl observed loudly. "My grandfather was actually in the war, and he doesn't go around bragging about it to strangers in malls." Plus, if she was really a soldier, "Where are all her army friends now?" asked another. "Real veterans stick together. They don't end up alone and pathetic." Margaret kept walking, her grocery bags growing heavier with each step. The exit seemed impossibly far away, and she could feel the stares of other shoppers burning into her back. Some were probably wondering if the teenagers were right to be suspicious of her claims. Others might be feeling sorry for her, which was almost worse than being mocked. As she finally approached the mall's main entrance, Margaret allowed herself to think about the friends the teenager had mentioned. Where were her army friends now? Most of them were dead, claimed by age or illness or the delayed effects of the things they had been exposed to during their service. A few lived in other states, scattered across the country like seeds blown by an unforgiving wind. The truth was that military service, especially for women of her generation, had been a complicated and often lonely experience. There had been camaraderie and bonds that civilians could never understand, but there had also been isolation and challenges that had nothing to do with combat or enemy forces. Margaret pushed through the heavy glass doors and stepped into the afternoon sunlight. The parking lot stretched before her, filled with cars that ranged from expensive luxury vehicles to aging economy models held together by hope and determination. She began the long walk to her own car, a 15-year-old sedan that she maintained herself as much as possible. Behind her, through the glass doors, she could see that the group of teenagers had returned to their table and were already moving on to other topics. Their attention spans were as short as their empathy, and she had provided them with only a few minutes of entertainment before becoming old news. As Margaret walked across the hot asphalt, she reflected on the encounter. She had revealed more about herself than she had intended, and it had accomplished nothing except to give the teenagers more ammunition for their cruelty. She should have remained silent, should have found another way to handle the situation. But as she reached her car and began loading her groceries into the trunk, Margaret felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Despite the pain of being mocked and dismissed, despite the frustration of not being believed, she felt a small spark of the pride she had once carried as a young service member. The emblem on her coat might be faded, and her stories might sound unbelievable to people who had never lived through anything more challenging than a difficult exam or a social media controversy. But the truth remained the truth, regardless of whether anyone believed it or acknowledged it. Margaret got into her car and started the engine, ready to drive home to her small apartment where no one would question her worth or demand proof of her experiences. She had no way of knowing that her day was far from over, and that very soon someone would see what the teenagers had been too ignorant and prejudiced to recognize. Margaret was halfway across the parking lot when she heard the distinctive sound of a car backfiring. The sharp crack echoed off the surrounding buildings, and she instinctively ducked slightly, her body responding to old training even after all these years. As she straightened up, she noticed a man in his 50s getting out of a black SUV several rows away. The man was tall and carried himself with the unmistakable bearing of a military officer. His hair was graying at the temples, and despite wearing civilian clothes, everything about his posture and movement spoke of decades of discipline and command. He was accompanied by a woman about his age and two young children who appeared to be his grandchildren. Margaret was fumbling with her car keys when she heard rapid footsteps approaching behind her. She turned to see the same teenage boy who had blocked her path in the mall, this time accompanied by two of his friends. They had apparently followed her outside, not ready to let their entertainment end. "Hey, Army lady," the boy called out, his voice carrying across the parking lot. "You forgot to tell us what rank you were. Were you a private? Did you ever actually leave the country, or did you just serve coffee at some base in Kansas?" Margaret's heart sank. She had hoped the encounter was over, but these young people seemed determined to continue their harassment. Other shoppers in the parking lot were beginning to notice the commotion, some stopping to watch while others hurried to their cars, eager to avoid any involvement. "Come on, tell us some war stories," demanded one of the other teenagers. "If you're such a hero, you must have some good ones. Or maybe you just cleaned bathrooms for real soldiers." The man who had gotten out of the SUV paused in the process of helping his grandchildren out of their car seats. His head turned toward the source of the voices, and his expression darkened as he took in the scene. He could see an elderly woman being confronted by teenagers who were clearly not showing respect. Margaret tried once again to end the confrontation. "Please leave me alone," she said firmly. "I've done nothing to bother you." "You bothered us by lying," retorted the first boy. "People who really serve their country don't end up looking like you. They get taken care of. They get respect. They don't shop for bargains and wear clothes from the garbage." The military officer was now walking toward them, his stride purposeful and his jaw set. His wife called after him, asking where he was going, but he didn't respond. His attention was completely focused on the elderly woman being harassed by the teenagers. As he got closer, the officer could see Margaret more clearly, and something about her caught his attention beyond just the unfair treatment she was receiving. There was something familiar about her posture, about the way she held herself even under stress. And then he saw it, the small, faded emblem on her coat. He stopped dead in his tracks, his eyes widening with recognition and disbelief. The emblem was barely visible, worn almost beyond recognition, but he knew exactly what it was. He had seen it before, had studied it in military history courses, had heard stories about the people who earned the right to wear it. "Excuse me," he said loudly, his voice carrying the unmistakable authority of command. The teenagers turned toward him, startled by the interruption and the tone of his voice. Margaret looked up as well, surprised by this unexpected intervention. The officer walked past the teenagers without acknowledging them and approached Margaret directly. When he was close enough to see the emblem clearly, he stopped and came to attention. Then, to the amazement of everyone watching, he saluted her. "Ma'am," he said formally, his voice filled with respect and something approaching awe. "General William Harrison, United States Army, retired. It is an honor to meet you." The teenagers stood frozen, their mouths hanging open as they tried to process what was happening. The idea that this elderly woman they had been mocking was being saluted by a general was so far outside their experience that they couldn't immediately comprehend it. Margaret stared at the man in shock. It had been years since anyone had recognized the emblem on her coat, and even longer since anyone had shown her the respect that came with military recognition. She slowly raised her hand to return his salute, muscle memory taking over despite her surprise. "Thank you, sir," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "Though I think you may be mistaken about what this emblem represents." General Harrison shook his head firmly. "No mistake, ma'am. That emblem represents the Army Nurse Corps, and unless I'm very wrong about the specific design, you served during some of the most dangerous and challenging conflicts of the last 40 years. The fading and wear patterns tell me you earned this during active combat deployment, not stateside service." The color drained from the teenagers' faces as the implications of the general's words sank in. Margaret looked down at her coat, then back at the officer who had recognized what they had failed to see. "I was deployed to 3 different conflict zones over 32 years, she admitted quietly. Field hospitals, forward medical stations, evacuation units. I retired as Colonel Margaret Chen, but I don't use the rank anymore. It seems to make people uncomfortable." General Harrison's expression grew even more respectful. "Colonel, you served in places and under conditions that most people couldn't imagine. Army nurses in combat zones faced the same dangers as any other soldier, plus the additional burden of trying to save lives under fire. You've earned more respect than most people will ever deserve." The first teenager, the one who had been most cruel in his mockery, tried to speak. We didn't know. I mean, she doesn't look like..." "Like what?" General Harrison turned toward the boy, his voice sharp with anger. "Like someone who spent 32 years serving her country? Like someone who probably saved more lives than you'll ever impact? Like someone who earned the right to wear any coat she chooses, regardless of its condition?" Other shoppers were gathering now, drawn by the unusual scene of a general publicly honoring an elderly woman in a parking lot. Margaret felt overwhelmed by the sudden attention, both positive and negative. She had grown accustomed to invisibility, and this sudden recognition was almost as uncomfortable as the earlier mockery. "Sir," she said to General Harrison, "I appreciate your recognition, but this really isn't necessary. These young people meant no harm." "No harm?" The general's voice rose slightly. "Colonel, they were harassing a decorated veteran based on her appearance and making assumptions about her worth based on her clothing. In my book, that's not just harmful, it's disgraceful." He turned back to the teenagers, who were now looking like they wanted nothing more than to disappear. "Do you understand what you've done here? You've spent the afternoon mocking someone who has done more for this country than you'll probably accomplish in your entire lives. Someone who risked her life repeatedly to save others." The silence stretched uncomfortably as the teenagers struggled to find words. Finally, the first girl spoke up, her voice much smaller than it had been earlier. "We're sorry. We really didn't know." "That's exactly the problem," General Harrison replied. "You didn't know, but you made judgments anyway. You decided that someone's worth could be determined by their clothing and their apparent financial situation. You never considered that there might be more to this woman than what you could see on the surface." Margaret felt a mixture of gratitude and embarrassment. While she appreciated the general's defense of her service and sacrifice, she was also uncomfortable with being the center of such a public scene. She had spent years avoiding exactly this kind of attention. "General Harrison," she said quietly, "while I'm grateful for your recognition, I should probably be going. This has been quite enough excitement for one day." The general nodded, understanding. "Of course, Colonel, but before you go, I want you to know that your service mattered. It made a difference, and anyone who suggests otherwise clearly doesn't understand what real heroism looks like." As Margaret got into her car, she could see the teenagers standing in awkward silence, probably replaying the afternoon's events and beginning to understand the magnitude of their mistake. The general was speaking quietly to them, his voice too low for her to hear, but his body language suggested he was delivering a lesson they wouldn't soon forget. Driving home, Margaret reflected on the strange turns her simple shopping trip had taken. She had experienced both the worst and best of human nature in the span of a few hours. The teenager's cruelty had reminded her why she usually kept her history private, but General Harrison's recognition had reminded her that her service had meaning beyond her own memories. The faded coat lay on the passenger seat beside her, looking exactly as worn and humble as it had that morning. But somehow, after being recognized for what it truly represented, it seemed to carry its age and wear with more dignity. Sometimes, Margaret realized, the most important things in life were not the newest or most impressive. Sometimes, they were the things that had proven their worth through time and service, through loyalty and endurance, through the quiet carrying of memories and meaning that others might never see or understand. The teenagers had learned a valuable lesson about the danger of judging people by their appearance. Margaret had been reminded that her years of service had not been forgotten by everyone. And in a mall parking lot on an ordinary afternoon, 2 generations had come together in a moment of recognition that would stay with all of them for the rest of their lives.